Tonight, Americans are seeing a number they were hoping not to see again. Gas is back at around $4 a gallon. And for millions of people, that is more than just an annoying price at the pump. It is a warning sign, a signal that something bigger is happening beneath the surface of the economy. Because when gas rises this fast, it rarely stays just about gas. It starts showing up everywhere else, in groceries, in shipping, in travel, in small business costs, and eventually in the mood of the entire country. For the first time since 2022, the U.S. national average for gasoline has moved back above the $4 mark, with recent reporting putting it at roughly $4.02 a gallon. AAA's price tracker has also shown the national average hovering right around that level. That may not sound dramatic to people in states that regularly pay more, but nationally, crossing that line matters. It is a psychological threshold, the moment where fuel stops feeling expensive and starts feeling like a crisis again. And this didn't happen in a vacuum. The biggest driver behind the latest surge is the war involving the United States, Israel, and Iran, which has shaken global oil markets and reignited fears of a supply shock. As the conflict escalated, crude oil prices jumped above $100 a barrel, and those higher crude costs began feeding directly into gasoline prices. In other words, what Americans are paying at the pump is now being shaped not only by local demand, but by a geopolitical crisis unfolding thousands of miles away. The core problem is simple. Oil markets run on confidence as much as they run on supply. The moment traders believe major shipments could be disrupted, prices move. And one of the most important choke points in the world is the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 1/5 of global oil consumption moves through that narrow route. So when conflict threatens traffic in that region, the entire market reacts. Even before shortages fully appear, the fear of shortage can send prices sharply higher. That is why this spike feels different from a normal seasonal increase. This is not just about a holiday weekend or more people driving. This is a market pricing in danger. And once oil starts climbing, the consequences spread fast. Refineries pay more for crude, transport companies pay more for diesel, airlines face higher fuel bills, retailers pay more to move goods, delivery networks pass those costs through the system. Before long, the consumer ends up paying more not just to fill the tank, but to live. Now, some people ask a fair question. If the United States is one of the world's largest oil producers, why can't America simply protect itself from a shock like this? The answer is that producing oil is not the same thing as instantly replacing a global supply chain. Oil has to be extracted, moved, refined, blended, and delivered. American refineries are built around specific grades of crude, logistics are constrained, and switching the system quickly is far harder than political talking points make it sound. That means even a country with huge production can still feel pain when the global market is thrown into chaos. And there is another layer here that makes the timing even worse. Every spring, the U.S. fuel system begins transitioning towards summer blend gasoline. That version is more expensive to produce because it uses formulations designed to reduce evaporation in warmer weather. According to both AAA and the U.S. Energy Information Administration, this seasonal switch tends to push prices higher as refiners adjust operations and as demand begins rising with spring travel and the approach of summer driving season. So even without a geopolitical shock, prices often drift up around this time of year. Add a war-driven oil surge on top of that, and the result is the kind of jump drivers are seeing now. That combination is what makes this moment so dangerous, because people can usually absorb one problem at a time. A normal spring increase, annoying but manageable. A distant geopolitical crisis on the news, concerning but abstract. But when those two forces hit together, the effect becomes personal very quickly. Suddenly, families start calculating every trip. Small businesses begin rethinking deliveries. Workers with long commutes feel like they are being punished just for showing up, and the broader economy begins to feel a squeeze that statistics often capture only after consumers have already changed their behavior. That is already beginning to show up in sentiment. Recent reporting on U.S. consumer confidence found that even as the headline numbers showed a slight improvement, households were increasingly worried about inflation and the broader economic outlook as energy costs surged. Expectations weakened enough to flash recession concerns, which tells you something important. Gas prices do not just hit wallets, they hit psychology. And in an economy driven heavily by consumer spending, psychology matters a lot. This is also why central bankers pay attention when energy spikes. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has said the Fed is watching these price shocks, but also made clear that there is only so much monetary policy can do when inflation is being pushed by a supply shock tied to war and energy. The Fed cannot drill for oil, it cannot reopen shipping lanes, it cannot calm a battlefield. What it can do is watch whether temporary pain turns into lasting inflation expectations. And that is the nightmare scenario, when people stop believing prices will settle back down. So this story is bigger than $4 a gallon. It's really about fragility, how quickly a conflict overseas can hit household budgets in America, how one number on a gas station sign can expose the hidden connections between war, oil, freight, inflation, and fear, and how an economy that already feels stretched can be pushed even further by a cost that people cannot easily avoid. You can delay a vacation, you can skip a restaurant, you can cut entertainment, but for millions of Americans, gasoline is not optional. It's the price of going to work, taking kids to school, running a business, and simply functioning in daily life. And that leads to the next question. If gas is back, who gets hit first? Is this mostly a problem for drivers, or does it spread much further than that? Which households can absorb it, and which ones start breaking under the pressure? And if this conflict drags on, how much worse could it get? That is where this story really begins. The first people hit by higher gas prices are not necessarily the wealthiest drivers with the biggest vehicles. It is often the people with the least room in their budgets, the households that are already calculating every grocery trip, every school pickup, every weekend shift, and every extra mile. Because when fuel gets more expensive, the real issue is not just how much you pay per gallon. The real issue is whether you have any financial cushion at all. And for millions of Americans, that cushion is already gone. That matters because transportation is not a luxury category in most of America. It is basic survival. U.S. Census commuting data shows that driving remains the dominant way Americans get to work, which means a huge share of workers cannot simply switch to another option when prices jump. In dense cities, some people can take a train or a bus, but in large parts of the country, there is no real substitute. If you work, you drive. If your child needs to get somewhere, you drive. If you live far from affordable housing, you drive even more. And that is where the burden becomes unequal very quickly. The U.S. Department of Transportation's equity metrics warned that when households spend a bigger share of income on transportation, they have less left for food, housing, education, and other essential needs. Bureau of Transportation Statistics reporting has shown this burden falls hardest on lower-income families, with the lowest-income households spending about 30% of after-tax income on transportation in 2022. So when gas jumps sharply, it is not just a frustrating headline. For many families, it is a direct attack on whatever money was supposed to cover everything else. That is why a rise in gasoline hits differently depending on who you are. For a higher-income household, a painful fill-up may mean delaying a dinner out, cutting back on entertainment, or feeling annoyed for a few weeks. For a lower-income worker with a long commute, it can mean something much harsher. It can mean taking on more credit card debt. It can mean skipping a non-urgent doctor visit. It can mean buying cheaper food, postponing a repair, or simply having no margin left at all. The same price shock arrives at the same gas station, but it does not land the same way in real life. And there's another group that gets squeezed almost immediately, the working middle class, not because they are the poorest, but because many of them have built their lives around distance, cheaper suburbs, longer commutes, more driving between work, school, errands, and childcare. These are the households that often look stable on paper. They may have jobs, cars, and a home, but they are also carrying mortgages, insurance, groceries, utilities, and debt. When gas climbs back over $4, that household math starts getting uglier fast. And once that happens, behavior changes. People begin consolidating trips. They stop making casual drives. They start saying no to weekend plans. They cut back on takeout, on non-essential shopping, on anything that feels optional. Recent reporting on U.S. consumer confidence found that even with a slight rise in the headline number, Americans were growing more worried about inflation, energy costs, and the economic outlook. In other words, households may still be functioning, but they are becoming more cautious, more defensive, and more anxious. And that shift matters because consumer spending is one of the main engines of the U.S. economy. This is where gas prices become more than a transportation story. They become a confidence story, a mood story, a story about whether people feel safe enough to keep spending, because fuel is one of the most visible prices in daily life. Most inflation is hidden inside receipts, subscriptions, rent, or bills, but gasoline is posted in giant numbers on street corners for everyone to see. It reminds people day after day that something is getting more expensive. And when that number keeps rising, it shapes expectations. People start assuming other prices will rise too. Sometimes they're right. That's because higher gasoline prices don't stay inside your fuel tank. They move through supply chains. EIA explains that the price of gasoline is built from several layers: crude oil, refining, distribution and marketing, and taxes. When crude oil surges, refiners and distributors feel it. When diesel climbs, trucking feels it. When transportation networks face higher operating costs, businesses begin looking for ways to pass those costs on. That doesn't happen evenly or instantly, but it happens, and the consumer usually meets those higher costs at the end of the chain. Think about how much of the modern economy depends on moving physical things: food, packages, building materials, household goods, medical supplies. Everything travels. Even if you don't drive much, the people and companies moving the products you buy almost certainly do. So when fuel costs rise, the pressure spreads outward. A store pays more to receive inventory. A contractor pays more to move equipment. A delivery operation pays more to complete routes. Multiply that across the economy, and suddenly gas becomes part of why everyday life feels more expensive, even for people who barely notice their own driving habits. You can already see early signs of that pass-through pressure. The U.S. Postal Service recently sought a temporary 8% surcharge on several package products in order to offset transportation costs. That's not the entire economy, but it's a powerful signal. When a system as large as USPS starts responding to higher transport expenses, it tells you the pain is moving beyond gas stations and into the cost structure of basic services. Once that happens, the story is no longer just about filling up. It becomes about the price of moving goods across the country. And then there's the timing. This is happening in an economy where many households already feel stretched. Housing remains expensive. Insurance has been rising in many places. Borrowing costs are still elevated. So higher gasoline arrives not as a single shock in an otherwise comfortable environment, but as one more bill in a stack of bills that already feels too high. That is why this new spike feels emotionally bigger than the raw price might suggest. It's landing on top of years of financial fatigue. The pressure is even harder in places where driving distances are longer and alternatives are weaker. Rural communities, outer suburbs, and regions with limited transit don't just experience higher prices, they experience dependence. They can't easily opt out. And because state taxes and regional fuel requirements differ, some areas can feel the increase more sharply than others. EIA notes that state taxes and fees, along with regional fuel rules and refining dynamics, spikes can have a large effect on retail gasoline prices. That means the same national story can become a very different local reality depending on where you live. So when people hear that gas is back over $4, the natural reaction is to think of it as a simple consumer annoyance, a pump problem, a daily inconvenience. But that misses the deeper truth. High gas prices act like a pressure multiplier. They intensify other financial stresses that were already there. They punish distance. They punish fragile budgets. They weaken confidence. And because so much of the economy depends on transport, they can quietly push up the price of life far beyond the gas station itself. And that raises the next question. If higher gas hits workers, households, and supply chains this quickly, who actually benefits from a spike like this? Who makes more money when fuel becomes more painful? Which industries gain, which industries lose, and why do price shocks like this always seem to create winners and losers at the same time? That's where the next part of the story goes. When gas shoots back above $4 a gallon, most people naturally focus on the pain at the pump, the pain in household budgets, the pain in freight, travel, and everyday spending. But every price spike also creates another side of the story, because in almost every energy shock, someone loses money, someone protects money, and someone makes even more of it. That is what makes moments like this so politically explosive. Americans feel squeezed, but not everyone is being squeezed in the same direction. Start with the most obvious potential winners, oil producers. When crude prices climb, the companies pulling oil out of the ground can often earn more per barrel, especially if their production costs do not rise as quickly as the market price. EIA's latest outlook says higher oil prices are expected to lead to more U.S. crude oil production in 2026, which tells you something important. High prices do not just reflect fear, they also create incentives. The more expensive oil becomes, the stronger the pressure to produce more of it. But even that story is not as simple as it sounds. Not every producer wins equally, and not every barrel can arrive fast enough to calm consumers. Oil fields cannot instantly solve a geopolitical shock. Wells, equipment, labor, transport, refining, and contracts all matter. So while higher prices may improve revenue for producers, that does not mean relief shows up quickly for drivers. In fact, one of the frustrating truths of energy markets is that prices can spike fast on fear, but supply takes much longer to respond. Then there are refiners, the companies that turn crude oil into usable fuels, like gasoline and diesel. EIA explains that refining is one of the key components in the retail price of gasoline, alongside crude oil, distribution and marketing, and taxes. That means refiners sit in a powerful position during energy stress. If crude prices rise and refining capacity is tight, the value of turning crude into fuel can increase. This is one reason why refinery constraints matter so much. Even if oil exists, consumers still need enough refining capacity to convert it into the gasoline they actually buy. And this is where the winners and losers start splitting apart fast. Producers may benefit from stronger crude prices. Some refiners may benefit from tight fuel markets, but many fuel buyers do not have that flexibility. Airlines, trucking fleets, delivery companies, contractors, farm operations, and any business that depends on heavy transportation suddenly face higher operating costs. They are not selling the energy shock, they are paying for it. And unless they can pass those costs on to customers, their margins get squeezed. That's especially true for transportation-heavy industries. Fuel is not a side expense for them, it's part of the business model. A company can sometimes delay hiring, delay expansion, or cut a marketing budget, but a delivery network cannot simply stop buying fuel. A truck still has to move, a plane still has to fly, a contractor still has to reach the job site. So when energy jumps, these sectors feel the shock almost immediately, and they often react by raising prices, slowing activity, or both. Consumers, of course, are among the clearest losers in the short term. They do not gain from higher crude. They do not collect refining margins. They simply face a larger bill for something many of them cannot avoid. AP's recent reporting shows the return of $4 gas is already feeding anxiety about inflation and broader economic stress. That's the hidden cruelty of fuel spikes. They hit people not only as drivers, but as buyers of everything moved by energy. And then there are politicians. Politically, a gas spike creates almost no easy winners. Even if the causes are global, voters still experience the pain locally. They see the sign outside the station. They see the receipt. They see the weekly budget getting tighter. That's why lawmakers are already pushing ideas like a temporary federal gas tax holiday. But even that has trade-offs. AP reports that some lawmakers support suspending the federal gas tax, while critics warn the savings may not fully reach consumers and could weaken infrastructure funding. So even the apparent solution comes with a second argument attached to it. This is what makes gas prices such a dangerous political symbol. People don't need an expert to understand them. They feel them. And because the number is public, visible, and repeated across every neighborhood, it becomes one of the fastest ways for economic frustration to turn into political anger. A lot of economic pain is abstract. Fuel is not. Fuel has a giant sign. There's also an international layer to this. When conflict threatens a major choke point like the Strait of Hormuz, the world is not just reacting to today's barrels, it's reacting to the fear of tomorrow's disruption. EIA's recent outlook notes that if reduced vessel traffic persists, storage behind the choke point can fill quickly, forcing producers to shut in even more output and adding more support to oil prices. That means volatility itself can become part of the problem. Markets are not waiting for a perfect shortage, they're pricing the risk of one. And in that kind of environment, one more group tends to benefit: whoever is positioned to sell certainty during uncertainty. That can mean energy producers with secure output. It can mean firms with pricing power. It can mean traders who move faster than ordinary consumers. But it almost never means the average household. The average household is the one absorbing the consequences after the market has already moved. So the story of $4 gas is not just that prices are rising, it's that rising prices rearrange pressure across the economy. They can strengthen revenues in one corner, squeeze margins in another, punish consumers almost everywhere, and trigger political panic all at once. One shock, many outcomes, different winners, different losers, same anxiety spreading through the system. And that leads to the final question. If this is where the pain starts, what happens next? Could gas go even higher? Is this just a temporary spike that fades as markets calm? Or is America staring at the beginning of another broader inflation problem that could last much longer than drivers want to believe? That is where the final part of the story begins. So, where does this go from here? That is the question hanging over drivers, businesses, policymakers, and markets right now. Because once gas pushes back above $4 a gallon, people do not just want an explanation, they want a timeline. They want to know whether this is the beginning of another long squeeze or just a painful spike that burns out before it reshapes the economy again. And the honest answer is that everything now depends on whether this crisis keeps spreading or finally starts cooling down. As of the latest reporting, the national average has been hovering around $4 a gallon, and analysts warn that if the disruption lasts, prices could climb meaningfully higher from here. The most important variable is still oil. Gasoline does not move in isolation. It follows crude, and crude right now is moving on fear, disruption, and war risk. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says Brent crude rose sharply after military action in the Middle East, with shipments through the Strait of Hormuz falling and some regional production shut in. In its latest outlook, EIA says Brent is expected to remain above $95 a barrel for the next 2 months, before falling later in 2026. But that forecast is heavily dependent on assumptions that transit resumes and outages gradually ease. In other words, the road back down exists, but it is built on de-escalation. That matters because markets are not only pricing what is happening now, they are pricing what could go wrong next. If tankers keep moving more normally, if the conflict cools, and if traders begin to believe the worst-case scenario is fading, oil can drop quickly. In fact, AP reported that crude briefly fell below $100 a barrel on renewed hopes the war could ease. But even that same reporting warned that some effects of the conflict could persist even if the fighting ends soon. That's the tricky part. The market can calm faster than the real-world costs do. So yes, there is a realistic path where gas prices come down from this panic zone. EIA's broader 2026 outlook still projects a U.S. retail gasoline average well below today's war-driven spike, around $3.34 for the year overall, with crude prices expected to soften later in the year as supply improves. That suggests today's jump is not automatically the new normal for all of 2026, but annual averages can hide a lot of pain. A household does not live in the yearly average, it lives in the weekly fill-up, and weekly fill-ups are being hit right now. There's also a harder scenario. If the Strait of Hormuz remains badly disrupted, if attacks on energy infrastructure continue, or if production losses deepen, then this could become more than a temporary shock. AP reports analysts see a path where U.S. gasoline moves toward $4.50 a gallon on average, and in a severe case could even approach the previous record near $5. That would not just be a consumer story anymore. That would be a broad inflation story, a political story, and potentially a growth story if households cut spending more aggressively. That's why governments are already searching for relief valves. One proposal is a temporary federal gas tax holiday. Supporters argue it could provide some immediate help, especially to lower and middle-income drivers. But critics point out that the federal tax is only 18.4 cents per gallon, that Congress would have to approve any suspension, and that not all of the savings would necessarily reach consumers. Some of the benefit can get absorbed elsewhere in the system, while the lost revenue weakens funding for highways and public transit. So even one of the most popular political fixes comes with serious limits. Another relief measure is the temporary expansion of E15 sales, a higher ethanol fuel blend that officials hope will bring pump prices down. But even here, the solution is partial. AP reports that E15 is not available everywhere. Some places don't have the infrastructure to expand it quickly, and some experts question whether the price benefit will be large enough to offset the trade-offs. There are also concerns about air quality, vehicle compatibility for some older engines, and even possible pressure on food costs if more corn is diverted toward fuel. So once again, there's no magic switch that erases the pain overnight. And that's the broader lesson of this story. America may produce a lot of oil. It may have emergency tools. It may debate tax breaks, fuel waivers, and policy responses. But when a global oil market is hit by a geopolitical shock, the country is not insulated from the consequences. Oil is traded globally, fear travels instantly, and consumers feel the impact long before any policy fix arrives. That's why even if prices eventually ease, the damage to confidence can linger. AP has already reported rising anxiety over inflation, softer expectations, and growing concern about affordability as gas prices surged. So what should viewers take away from all this? First, $4 gas is not just a number, it's a pressure signal. It tells you that something deep in the global system is under stress. Second, whether prices fall or rise from here will depend less on campaign slogans and more on shipping routes, oil flows, and whether the conflict actually de-escalates. And third, even if the worst-case scenario is avoided, this episode has already shown how fragile daily affordability can be when one essential cost suddenly spikes. because that's what makes this story so powerful. Gas is not optional for millions of people. It's not a luxury subscription that can be canceled. It's the cost of going to work, getting children to school, making deliveries, visiting family, running a farm, keeping a small business alive, and staying connected to daily life. When that cost jumps, the impact spreads outward into everything else people are already struggling to afford: housing, food, debt, insurance, savings, confidence. One price at the pump can expose the pressure across an entire economy. And that may be the real reason this moment matters. Not because gas crossed $4, but because it reminded Americans how quickly stability can disappear. One war, one choke point, one market panic, and suddenly a routine drive starts feeling like an economic warning. Gas is back. The bigger question is whether the country is ready for everything that comes with it.